Hello, I'm here today with Malcolm Balk, who many of you will know as an Alexander teacher and a running coach from Canada. Hi there, Malcolm.
Hi there, Andy. Good to see you.
You too, thanks for joining us. Malcolm will be talking today about Alexander's direction of knees forward and away, which for him has changed a little bit over the last few years. He'll come on to talk about that a bit more and how maybe this new understanding can help us as Alexander teachers adapt the way we teach walking and running and even standing. But before you do that, Malcolm, perhaps you can give us a little bit of background as to your own kind of history with Alexander work, how you came across the technique and how your career has evolved over the years.
Sure, be happy to. I heard about the Alexander technique in the late 70s from my cello teacher. I was an adult, enthusiastic adult cello student, and suffered a lot from tension. I think that I brought in as just in terms of my personality, and also from my background in hockey. I was very competitive hockey player, ice hockey player. And she came back after being in England and talked about this Alexander technique and, freeing your neck and all this. And we thought she was a little bit, she'd lost it a little bit, but it seemed to offer, as I got into it and started to read about the Alexander technique, it seemed to offer a way forward for me to deal with the tension that I was fighting as a cellist. So I started having lessons, and one thing led to another. And I decided to train as an Alexander teacher. I remember thinking, I think in my late 20s at the time, that this was something I could do my whole life. And here I am 40 years later, geez, time does fly. Still doing it and still very enthusiastic about it. I trained in London in the early 80s with Patrick McDonald and Shoshana Kiminitz. It was a fantastic period in my life. I enjoyed the training so much and spending time in London. And then I moved back to Montreal, but regularly visited the UK on a regular basis, and started to develop a little bit of work with runners in the late 80s when I was asked to show a group of Alexander teachers something about running at the Brighton Congress. This led to me coming up with my first Art of Running workshop a couple years later at the Congress in Engelberg, and then developing something that I kind of peddled around to various training schools through the 90s up until present time. So I think I'm probably known most in the Alexander world as the running guy, but in fact, a lot of my work, maybe most of my work, otherwise has been done with musicians. I'm still playing the cello today. I'm still taking lessons. Still feel like I'm improving. I've also written a couple of books on, the application of the Alexander technique to running and also to the gym. And lately, I've come across the work of a chap by the name of Gary Ward. And for the last couple of years, I've been really interested in how Gary Ward's work links up with Alexander and provides perhaps some very interesting insights into what's actually going on in terms of our functioning, particularly when it comes to gait, walking and running. So I've been presenting some workshops during this COVID period since March online, where I've been trying to share some of these ideas with people and trying to help them apply some of these ideas to their own work, either with themselves or with their students when it comes to walking and running, and perhaps shedding some light on Alexander's directions, at least the ones that I was familiar with, in particular the ideas of the knees going forward and away, which is something I think we could talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I love about your work is that you're always looking to bring new ideas into your teaching, whether it's from within Alexander work or from outside. So can you tell us a bit more about what you've learned from Gary Ward's and his way of working, and a bit about the biomechanics of the foot particularly, and how that's influencing what you're talking about today?
Sure. And I'll speak about myself, and maybe for some Alexander teachers, this might sort of echo for you as well, or resonate for you as well. But basically, my understanding that I got from my training and my thinking about the Alexander technique and movement, basically put movement in sort of a one-dimensional plane. Okay, so one-dimensional mean basically forwards and backwards. So knees move forward, legs move forwards and backwards. The spine stays basically, in one state, lengthened and lengthening. The head stays poised on top of the spine, and you move, and the legs move forwards and backwards. And the feet reflect a little bit that idea that they're going to move forwards and backwards. They land on the ground, you roll through the foot, and you come off of it. So that was my conception, of movement, both in running, walking, and running. And it was only when I suffered, an injury in my hamstring training, for a competition a number of years ago, and I couldn't get it right. And I tried all sorts of things in addition to Alexander. Can I admit that I tried, acupuncture and deep, tissue massage, and I threw everything that I could at it because I was a bit desperate. When you have a hamstring problem, it only hurts every second step, So when you figure you're taking 180 steps a minute when you're running and running 5 hours a week, you're in a lot of discomfort a lot of the time. And it was no fun. I didn't get any joy at all until I went and worked with a woman by the name of Helen Hall, who's there in the UK. And she is a disciple, can I say, of Gary Ward, and had applied his work to running. In fact, wrote a book herself called Even With Your Shoes On. And she had a look at me on her. She's got this fancy dancy treadmill, 70,000 euro or $100,000 euro treadmill, which can measure, gait in 3 dimensions. It was originally developed to work with kids with scoliosis that they didn't want to do an invasive procedure on to notice if the spine was, how much curvature of the spine was going on. So they used video to be able to measure what was going on in the spine and all the rest of the joints. So when she puts you on this treadmill, she can see what's going on in every joint in your body, in 4 dimensions, not 1 dimension, 4 dimensions. I don't know what the 4th one is, to be honest with you, at the moment, but you can imagine 3 dimensions. So she put me on there, and she said, just come and have a look at this. And there was a graph of what my feet were doing from the time the foot would land on the ground to the time the toes would come off as I was walking or running. And she says, do you see this, like from the time your heel touches when you're walking to the time your toes come off, there's a straight line. And I went, yeah, right on. And I've been practicing that for 40 years. Yeah, heel lands right through the foot, 1 dimensional. She goes, oh no, that's not what your foot is designed to do. And there was a silence as I think of 30 years of practice, knees forward and away. What the heck have I been doing for 30 years? I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, your foot is meant to pronate and supinate. Those are the 2 end ranges of movement. It's not just this, it's a little bit of rocking and rolling in there as well. And on top of it, she said, when the heel does one thing, the forefoot does something else. They're in opposition to each other. And the toes are in opposition to what the foot. I went, you're joking. She says, well, let's just try something. So she had me sort of go into a lunge, and she put a wedge under my foot, and she had me put weight into her foot and then take weight off. I can demonstrate it right now. So this is what it looked like. We all do this in the Alexander world. You put your 1 leg forward and 1 leg back. Is that okay, Annie? Can you see?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
And she took a little wedge, and she put it under my big toe joint, and she just had me put weight into it. Because she said, on your right leg, you don't pronate. It just stays straight, with the weight a little bit more towards the outside. So she did this 8 times with me. And then I stood up, and I walked back to the treadmill. And as I walked back to the treadmill, I would have bet my house that I was leaning over to one side like this. And I asked her that. I said, this feels really odd. And she said, am I leaning over to one side? She says, no, you're perfectly straight. I said, you're joking. Because every cell in my body told me I was leaning over like this. Long story short, I get back on the treadmill. She records me again. We get off the treadmill, and now we look at the lines on the recording. Instead of them running just like this, there's a almost like a circle of movement as the foot lands that rolls in and rolls out. It's not a thin line. It's a much broader line. And not only on my right foot, which is the only one that we worked on, but my left foot had changed as well. And even more importantly, at that point, my hamstring, which had been bugging me for the better part of 5 years, felt different. I can't describe it except that, when you've had an injury and you can feel it starting to get better, you have a sense of, oh yes, something has changed, and it's not perfect yet, but it's moving in the right direction. And that was it was almost an emotional experience. It was like, oh my God, what is going on here? Long story short, I wanted to learn more about this. So I signed up for one of Gary's courses, and I started to learn a lot more about joint mechanics and what's actually happening in the bones and how the muscles respond to that movement. And it was very, very interesting and slightly overwhelming, because at the end of the week, we could tell you what every joint of the body was doing in 7 phases of walking, which works out to 440 different boxes being filled in. Completely overwhelming. The long and the short of it is that, and this was a change for me, is that instead of the body, in my conception of the body sort of maintaining a one-dimensional position and movement, and the legs kind of just pitter-paddling underneath, that there's a sense of going from a neutral place, which is what we sort of do very well in the Alexander technique when we stand and we get things to lengthen and widen. You go from that neutral place, and that neutral place deforms into a step with the right leg, comes back to neutral as the left leg comes forward and meets the right leg. And then as the left leg goes forward again, the whole thing deforms again. So as the front leg is going forward and lands, the front foot pronates. So there's a movement sort of towards the inside, and the back leg supinates. So there's a movement, roughly speaking, towards the outside. And then it comes back into neutral, and then it deforms again. And this is repeated. And the amount of time that the foot actually spends on the ground is, fractions of a second. And these phases of movement are even smaller fractions of a second, but nevertheless can be measured, especially when you're using high-speed photography and you're taking 240 frames a second. You can measure these moments quite clearly. For most of us, it'll just go by in a blur, and we say, oh yeah, nice pair of trainers or whatever. But when you actually start to analyze it and you notice all these things going on, they're very obvious. And not only that, they're not only obvious, but they're important. And I remember reading back in the day how, Alexander was described as Alexander has discovered something that only he can observe, but that the whole of humanity requires, or something like that. It's one of those sorts of statements. And the same thing I think is important here in terms of watching what actually happens in the foot, and then what happens to the body as we go up the food chain to those movements of the foot as we go through the walking or the running cycle. So, knees forward and away. Well, when the foot pronates, the weight moves medially, moves inwards on the foot. So here's a left foot. So when we put weight on that foot, the weight moves that way on the foot, and forward on the foot. So it's almost like a diagonal line going from the heel, outside of the heel, moving forwards and then towards the big toe. Okay? That's the natural, that's the way these bones are set up mechanically to move. If you allow that, and if you're able to allow that, because you might have an injury or habits which interfere with that. But that's ideally how they're designed, how it's designed to move. In order for that to happen, when the foot pronates and the talus, which is the bone that the shin bone, the tibia sits on, when that talus rotates inwards, is what happens in pronation. The shin rotates inwards, the tibia rotates inwards, and the femur, the thigh bone, also rotates inwards. So in that moment, when the foot needs to pronate and load, in other words, muscles get stretched a little bit in preparation to being able to spring back and cause the foot to supinate as it moves, the body moves, the leg moves behind us, and that leg becomes a rigid lever getting ready to push us forward, okay? As that foot pronates, the talus rotates inwards, the shin rotates inwards, the femur rotates inwards, and the pelvis all rotate inwards at different speeds. So at that point, the knee cannot be going forward and away, because if it is, you can't pronate. And if you can't pronate, you can't load the structures to get that elastic recoil, which brings you back into the next phase. So when I realized all this, I went, holy tamale. Alexander was right about the knee going forward and away, but without being, this might sound disparaging, but it's sort of like a stopped clock is right twice a day. Alexander was right. The knee does go forward and away twice a day, kind of to belabor that metaphor. Okay, so when the foot starts to then come out of pronation, and the talus then starts to move, instead of being internally rotated, it starts to move externally. So here's our talus. It's that bone right there that if you look at it at the back, you can see it. It's that bone there. After you pronate and the talus is moved inwards, it starts to move outwards, come back, goes through neutral and starts to move outwards a little bit to allow the foot to supinate, which means that the shin at that point starts to rotate outwards, the thigh starts to rotate outwards, and the pelvis starts to rotate outwards at different speeds. And at that point, the knee could be described as being forward and away. But at least in gait, it doesn't stay there. The cycle then repeats. So yes, forward and away is a moment, but it's only a moment. And I think that was a big change for me in terms of thinking about movement. Instead of thinking of movement in one plane, which forward and away seems to apply, it's always forward and away. That's one plane of movement. When you think of movement in 3 dimensions, so not only movement from the side, but also what's happening to the movement from the front when you look at the body from the front, and then what's happening to movement when you look at it from the top, which would be much more of a kind of a spiral type of movement, you realize that forward and away needs to, at least to me, I needed to expand my understanding of what forward and away means. Okay, I needed to put a little bit more flesh on those bones. So when in walking, why would I want to let my knee move in when all it needs to do is move back and forth and stay on that nice straight line? And the answer is, it's in the bones, because bones are not designed to stay in straight lines. They're designed to move. They're designed to move in 3 planes of movement. And muscles are designed to help control those movements. And that's what I've been learning with Gary Ward, and that's what I find fascinating and exciting. And it has given me a whole different way of looking at and working with people. So for example, I might work with a violinist on what they're actually doing with their legs. Like, can they let their bones in their legs and can they let their pelvis move, in 3 dimensions? Might work on them walking around and getting their legs to move different. And all of a sudden they come back up here. And it's funny how all those movements in the legs filter right up to what's happening in the torso and even in the head. And I know this might sound blasphemous, but guess what, folks? The head does not always go forward and up. It has to go forward and up from something. So in gait, at least, there are times when the head moves back and down. Not for long, doesn't stay there, but it does move there, and we can measure it. So maybe I'm just reaching a mature understanding of the Alexander technique, that it doesn't have to be as rigidly one thing as I thought it had to be. And it just led to certain questions about, okay, so what are the constants and what are the variables? I'm questioning, Gary's work has thrown a lot of things that I thought were constant and put them in the variable bag at this point. And then maybe said, well, there must be some constant to it, because I'm still experiencing benefits of the Alexander technique 40 years after I started it. What has stayed constant in all that time? I'm asking more questions than I have answers for at this point, which might piss some people off. But look, it's all part of the learning process, because it's going to take me to whatever that next level of understanding happens to be.
So you talked about how this has changed your understanding. How has it changed your teaching in workshops and one-to-ones? What do you do? How do you relate it to the work?
Well, I'll give you a very good example. I did a Zoom workshop recently with a group of singers, and I love working with singers. And one of the things that Gary's work had pointed out to us was that the body, sort of the brain organizes us around center. So you could sort of think of center as that midline of the body where the spine finds itself. And then we've got arms and legs on either side of that center, and it's relatively balanced, or it's meant to be. But for various reasons, we may find that our sense of center has shifted over time, and that it's no longer right in the middle. And one of the ways you can sort of do this, if you happen to have a 5,000-pound force plate lying around, or failing that, stand on one of those Wii dance platforms that they're only about 30 quid. Get yourself one of those and stand on it, and get yourself so where you think that your weight is 50-50, and then have a look at the force plate, and you may find that what you thought was 50-50 was 60% on the left leg and 40% on the right leg, but for you it felt like 50-50. So what that means is that your pelvis has shifted. Your pelvis is no longer in the middle. And your brain has simply adapted to that and reorganized you so that you can still, walk and run and, dance and make tea and whatever you need to do, but you're not centered. So even without a force plate, what I did in the workshop is I said, well, when your center shifts and everything then has to adapt, it means that some parts of your body are working harder than they're meant to, and other parts are kind of a little bit like City of Montreal workers. They're kind of just sitting around, having a smoke and waiting for the poor bugger down in the hole with water up to his butt to finish up so they can go on the next break. So, and in singing, you hear this, even though people can't adapt and sing very well, when you get people to balance better, as I often will do in a workshop, the quality of their voice changes without any discussion of vocal technique. And I'm sure Alexander teachers who work with singers have experienced this, not only with singers, but with instrumentalists and pianists even. I had the group kind of just get a rough sense of, if weight ideally is 50-50 side to side and 50-50 heel to forefoot, we'll just say for argument that that's kind of neutral. I asked them to assess themselves where their weight balance, how their weight was distributed. And, on the chat box that we have on Zoom, I got 70-30, 40, 60, all sorts of different, there were maybe 12 or 15 people in the class, and no one was the same. And, and there was no, sometimes the weight was more on the left, sometimes the weight was more on the right, sometimes the weight was more on the forefoot, sometimes the weight was more on the heel, depending on what, it was fascinating. So, Alexander teachers would like this. So I said, right, okay, so just for fun, rebalance yourselves so that it's 50-50 side to side and 50-50 heel forefoot. So they all shifted around a little bit. And I said, now what does that feel like to you? And it's the experience that we've all, had when working with a pupil who's maybe standing with, their weight over to one side. You move them so that they're more balanced and more centered, and they all feel like they're leaning over or they're leaning backwards, when in fact, they're vertically speaking, they're much more, I know we don't like that word stacked in the Alexander world, but they're kind of much more aligned. I know we don't like that word either, but these are useful terms. And then sort of said, well, yeah, so now walk around and come back and stand there and, and see, well, where do you go? Where's your preference? Where's your default program in terms of how you balance yourselves? And then people started talking about, well, why they like to put one foot forward and put more weight on it. One woman said, well, it's my way of dealing with stage fright. I kind of stay back away from the audience, and I stick one foot in front of me, and I kind of keep my weight back, and, and described what we may call more emotional or cognitive issues related to their balance. Now, what is this but the use of the self? And I know some people out there think you can't really teach Alexander online, but it's not the same as with the hands-on, but there's a lot you can do. And so I found that Gary's work informs what I would normally do as in an Alexander sense in a lesson. And I understand a lot more what's going on there, because I would now relate to those foot balances in terms of what actually happens in terms of gait. How do they walk? Do they transfer weight equally from one side to another, or do they tend to keep the weight on more on one leg than the other? And how does that play out for them in terms of the quality of their movement, how they feel in their bodies, injuries, recovery? There are lots of things that you can begin to get into there. So that gives you a little.
Would you do the lunges on the wedges as well, for example? Is that something that you take into workshops as
Yes. Yes. Well, one of the things that that we all know about, but at least intellectually, but it was a bit of a rude awakening for me, is this whole idea of the triangle of support. So the triangle of support, and I asked this at the AMSAT general meeting 2 years ago in New York. I asked everybody, does everybody know where the triangle of support is on the foot? And there were 20 people in the class. Do you think I got consensus from 20 people in that class? So I got all kinds of different answers. Some people never heard of the triangle. Some people said the triangle was in different places on the foot than what I understand, or what the foot seems to indicate. But the triangle, as I understand it, would be, logically speaking, would be the bits of the foot that are closest to the ground. Makes sort of sense, right? If you have a three-legged stool, it's the bottom of each leg that actually supports the stool on the surface. That would make sense to me. So when you look at the foot, it's really obvious. It's the heel, the first metatarsal head, and the fifth, because those are the biggest bumps that stick down closest to the floor, right? So that's your triangle. Now, the interesting thing is that if you ask somebody to go into a lunge and bend their front knee and put their, let's say, 70 kilos of weight into their front foot, and I've had people put 100 kilos of weight into the front foot, incredibly powerful as I might look, I can't lift 100 kilos with 3 fingers. But that person putting 100 kilos into weight, I can sometimes go and put my fingers underneath their foot on the spot that they're meant to be balancing. So they're putting 100 kilos of weight theoretically into that, into that first metatarsal head, and I can put my hand underneath, which means that their weight is not going into the place where it's supposed to. And the question you have to ask, if it's not going there, where the hell is it going? And where it's going is probably into one of the other, joints in the foot. It's sort of more towards the middle, which means that instead of balancing on a nice big tripod, you're now balancing on a skate. It's not quite the same level of balance. So if that's how people balance, what happens to the rest of the structure? What are muscles doing to keep you from falling on your butt? Well, we all explore that as Alexander teaches. We can see what people are holding and tightening and all the rest of it. But the reason they may be doing that is because they don't actually have what's supposed to be on the ground on the ground. And we tend to emphasize in Alexander, the heel. Oh, you get your weight into your heels. But, again, that's not really how the foot's designed. The foot is a tripod. It's meant to be, the balance is meant to be distributed a little bit more evenly, as far as I understand. And particularly in movement, you got to be able to move through those balance points and then reconstruct them. Okay, so in lessons, first of all, I'll find out how people are balancing on their feet. And it's amazing that if they don't have weight, let's say going into this bone, the first metatarsal, and what you do is you take a wedge or you take just a cloth or something, and because that part of their foot is off the ground, what you do with the wedge is you bring the ground up to that bone, and then you have them put weight into that bone. So now the brain is getting new information. The brain is getting information that, weight can go into that first metatarsal. It is going into that first metatarsal. So you repeat that 6 or 8 times. You don't have to do it very much. And then you have somebody walk around after that, and all of a sudden they'll come back to you and they'll say, oh my goodness, I feel my foot on the ground for the first time. Or I understand what that triangle means now. It's not just an intellectual concept, it's something that I'm living. And, I'm breathing better. Oh. And you remember I'm sure you remember from Alexander's use of the self, how the only time that he actually experienced a global change, a global improvement in his use, was when he improved the use or got rid of the misuse of his feet and legs. It was the only time. It wasn't when he changed his neck or head or lengthened his spine. It's when he fixed his feet. Right? It's only mentioned once, and then he moves on. And I've often wondered, well, why didn't Alexander work more with the feet after that? Well, who wants, in Victorian times when people might have washed, once a month, whether they needed to or not, who wants to get down there and work on people's feet? It's not very elegant. It didn't fit his image. It's a very dapper guy. Hello. So it's much nicer to work up here. Anyway, that's my theory. Take it or leave it.
So, how can we avoid the classic Alexander students' mistake of trying to do this pronation and then do the supination afterwards? What advice would you have on that?
Well, I would first of all say don't avoid, do it. First of all, the brain doesn't understand subtlety. You have to remind the brain what the feet are meant to do. So don't be subtle about it. Get it to the point where it's like slapping you upside the face with a wet fish. Your brain will notice it. You're reminding your brain of what the foot is supposed to do. Once you remind the brain what's supposed to be going on, as Marjorie Barlow says, told me once, when it's working well, do less. There's no use starting out by doing less. You need to know what's supposed to be going on. So you actually get people to learn. I actually get people to exaggerate, get to the end range of what is pronation, what is supination, exaggerate it so they know what it is, so their brain knows what it is. Because when you're actually walking, you've got fractions of a second when these moments are happening. They're fractions of a second. And they're too fast for you to control consciously in real time. Impossible. Your brain cannot get messages there fast enough in real time. So you have no choice but to let it happen. If you don't, you're going to probably fall down or hurt yourself because you can't coordinate it. You can't coordinate it properly. And in running, it's even less time because your foot spends even less time on the ground in running than it does in walking. Your cadence in running is faster than it is in walking. So your foot is on the ground for even less time, even less chance to consciously control it. And Alexander actually said, the work is not about trying to control things consciously. It's about a plane of conscious control is a plane of existence. It's not the means. So going down and actually doing it is simply figuring it out. It's like playing, learning a passage in music. You play it way under tempo, really slowly, so that you kind of know what's supposed to happen. And then at some point, you have to get out of the way and let it happen at the speed it's meant to be played. You don't try to consciously control it at that point. It just has to happen. So I think it's very similar in terms of movement.
So get yourself a wedge and do these little exercises every day or every lesson you have with a pupil or before you go for a run, that sort of thing, to get the brain wired in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Remind your brain, because you've got habit that's reminding your feet of what they're supposed to do. It may not be what you want them, what they're designed to do. So remind yourself, those points are meant to be in contact on the ground when we're standing and through the movement cycle. Just remind yourself of that. You're fine when as soon as you remind yourself of where those points are, you can't sense them. That when you walk, you immediately notice a difference in the quality of your walk or your run.
Fascinating stuff, Malcolm. Really appreciate your time today. You've gone into a lot of depth, so thanks very much for your time. And if there's nothing else to add, I'll say goodbye.
You're very welcome, Andy. It was great talking to you. Stay well. Great to see you.
You too.
And look forward to chatting with you another time.
Thanks, Malcolm.